Facts Patriarchists don't want you to know. Episode 5 Feminine Powers Links to Ancient Magic. The power of the feminine. So, why was women's magic considered so powerful by our ancient ancestors that the adult women of so many communities willingly secreted themselves away for their moon time every month? Women were tied to the cosmos, primarily through the symbolic parallels between the monthly moon phases and a woman's typical menstrual cycle. Because this was a cosmic connection, not just an earthly one, women's magic was considered superior to men's magic, especially during a woman's menstrual period. So women hid their faces like the moon, to quote an American Indian way of putting it. Usually, this self isolation was in a building constructed specifically for and by the women of the community during this most powerfully magical time. Since women in the smaller communities often have synced cycles, these tents or huts would have been spacious enough for several women at a time, and many of them probably brought their infants and toddlers with them. Any items they created during that isolation would have been assumed to be imbued with female magic. In the same way, many modern pagans charge items using various moon phases. The moon was a vital element for the foragers who lived semi or fully nomadic lifestyles, even before the need to worry about when to plant crops for sedentary groups. Because knowing what plants grow in which moons and which animals congregate in the biggest herds during certain times of the year allowed such groups to forage for food more easily. There were then cycles of plenty. Paleolithic cave paintings indicate that our ancient ancestors monitored such animal activity carefully. In 2022, for instance, Bennett Bacon, an amateur archaeologist, interpreted this common symbol, the Y, next to different animals as indicating a time when these animals gave birth. He was on the right track, except that he believed these humans had already determined the connection between one type of sexuality, heterosexual coitus, and pregnancy. Instead, this Y symbol actually is an imitation of the shape of all mammal reproductive organs, the uterus and the fallopian tubes in particular. Thus, while the symbol indicates birth, it isn't two bearing one, as this androcentric theorist speculates. Instead, it echoes all the other Bucrania symbols that proliferate so many archaeological finds, because the skulls of herd animals perfectly symbolizes the female reproductive organs, the origin of all mammalian life. Females, then, were the creators, which is why so many of the most prominent gods for early humans were female. As a kid, fascinated by ancient Greek and Roman gods and goddesses, I often wondered why so many goddesses were labeled as those of love and war. It wasn't until I conducted a deep dive into ancient cultures and began reading those artifacts and myths from a gynocentric perspective that this label began to make sense. Women were, our ancient ancestors believed, engaged in a cosmic battle, which is why they shed blood every month. Blood shed from that cosmic battle. A cosmic battle that made goddesses and women warriors. Yet women were also highly sexual, which our Victorian male scientists believed should just be translated as love, since sex had become, by that time in the patriarchal cycle, a dirty, unspeakable act, and any woman who enjoyed sex was suspected of being a harlot, a word commonly thrown around not only in the Judaic Christian Bible, but also used to interpret any woman who used sex to heal or to transform someone in ancient texts. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, Gilgamesh is having sex with anyone and everyone he wants to have sex with as the leader of his community. So the city elders plead with the gods to intervene. The gods, then, have the goddess of human creation form a wild man, Enkidu. However, as long as Enkidu is wild and roaming the forest, he cannot help tame Gilgamesh's rash and impulsive sexual behavior. So a priestess from Inanna's temple transforms Enkidu into a human being through Hashadu, a sacred form of sex. Yet the scholars who interpret these passages continually refer to her as a harlot or harridan, dismissing her sexual powers to transform. For our ancient ancestors, sex equaled spiritual ascension. Evidence abounds from around the world that most ancient people thought that most forms of sexual contact were transformative, spiritually powerful moments that helped human beings, reach something like a godlike feeling through orgasm. For instance, the moche from Peru, sex pots demonstrate that all forms of sex were spiritual, especially when the couple having sexual contact are skeletons. Most scholars struggle to make these cosmic connections, some believing the pots are teaching guides about how to avoid pregnancy, one of the extreme ideas, despite lingering language equating orgasm with the little death. Because of patriarchist androcentric bias, which attempts to erase the influence of women, the power of the feminine, and sexual, spiritual healing and sexual transformation, in interpreting most archaeological finds and ancient texts, we have missed so much of our actual ancient ancestors' passions about spirituality and sex's role in that pursuit. Such androcentric bias has led patriarchist scholars to call the women who ran ancient Crete a college of women, instead of admitting that it was a full on matriarchal culture. Indeed, archaeology on Crete got off on terrible footing, which is why the ancient people of Crete, properly called Cretans, are still called Minoans, named after a mythical king the early archaeologists wanted to prove ruled there. Male transcendence. After Egyptians finally, circa 2400 BCE, were able to determine that males play a role in pregnancy, androcentrism took off because, for most of humanity's existence, women had been the creators. So males seized their chance to transcend women in both spiritual and cultural power by making themselves and their gods the creators. We can see ample evidence for these shifts from gynocentric to androcentric religious views through many myths and archaeological artifacts, so I explore a great number of these pieces of evidence in my book, Pitiless Bronze, a post-patriarchal examination of pre-patriarchal cultures. Lest it seem as though all ancient cultures revolve solely around female magic, we need to highlight some male magic that was vital to our ancestors. And that evidence revolves around the most magic, visible bodily organ on any human being, the penis. Modern humans tend to be embarrassed by naked penises because patriarchies preach that sex is dirty, sinful. Thus, the organs that commit sex are also dirty, so should remain invisible. Yet it is clear from historical evidence alone, not to mention pre-literate symbolism, that male magic revolved around penises and their ability to grow from a flaccid body part to a turgid, fully erect organ in a short time. This magic was associated with springtime, especially because a penis seems to grow as fast as grasses, as evidenced in the Sumerian tale of Enki and Ninhursag. but also emits fluids that are interchangeably called milk and rain or fresh water, also known as the apsu. Getting men to ejaculate a lot during the early spring, think the celebrations of Imbolc or Valentine's Day, was a form of sympathetic magic to encourage rain to fall, rivers to flow, and crops to grow. Remember, though, our ancient ancestors did not know of the connection between one type of sexual contact, heterosexual coitus, with pregnancy yet. So penises and sex that caused males to ejaculate were not associated with human fertility at this time. Instead, they were related to the fertility of the land. A common misconception by people who find it challenging to think about sexual organs without associating them with pregnancy. Another form of male magic actually borrowed heavily from female magic, especially women's ability to bleed but not die. To create sympathetic magic so that they could acquire this ability, men created circumcision and penile piercing. The fascia that Roman soldiers who had long forgotten the origin of the magical amulets they wore were examples of this female magic turned into male magic. In essence, they tapped into the power of the feminine in order to draw on what they saw as protective powers. Ironically, Judaic males will adopt circumcision as a sign that the men have dedicated themselves to El, Yahweh, Jehovah, and many Abrahamic religion based organizations still insist on continuing to remove up to 40% of the most sensitive penile tissue as a form of cleanliness that is actually geared toward desensitizing penises, much in the same way that female circumcision is supposed to keep women from wanting sex. One tragic consequence for males, then, in Abrahamic religions that require circumcision is the fact that their penises become so desensitized by circumcision that many seek rougher and more violent forms of sex in their efforts to find sexual gratification. This problem has led to more circumcised males being incarcerated for rape than men who are not circumcised. Overall, the goal of patriarchies everywhere is to hide or oppress knowledge about the power of the feminine, which includes suppressing sexual desire in both men and women. Hypocritically, more male patriarchists, especially wealthy ones, have more sex than the average male, a phenomenon that even happened during the Bronze Age, when the first female oppression began. We know this because during that time, DNA studies have shown that for every one male passing on his DNA, 17 women were passing on theirs. Sadly, all this knowledge I've shared with you about the origins of the power of the feminine and its subsequent suppression by patriarchies is just the tip of the iceberg. Be certain to read my book, Pitiless Bronze, a post patriarchal examination of pre patriarchal cultures, which details the evidence I gathered in the 7 years of research I conducted on pre patriarchal cultures around the Mediterranean and in Central America. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share so that others can learn the real truth.